Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Come with me as we step into the deep, dark backcountry, the dark, deep forests, and let's hope that we see sunrise in the morning. Creepy creatures, cryptid shenanigans, and nightmare fuel. I hope you guys enjoy this one. Of course, please do let me know down below in the comments. As ever, please do like and share. Without further ado, The Deep Woods, Part 1 to 3. Let's get straight into that. At the time, everybody told me I was crazy, but I didn't listen. I had known then what I know now. I would have listened. Growing up in the city, I'd always had a fascination with the woods, not the small, leafy areas between our commuter suburb and the next, but the big woods, the bush, places where the trees stretched unbroken for miles, as far as the eye could see, where habitation was scarce, and people even more scarce. Although, through high school, I hunted with my dad and uncles, and like most kids my age, went off to summer camps each year, all of which were well out of the town, on the edge of the bush. I got to know my way around some real wilderness areas, and I got to know all of the animals that live in them. You'll see later why that is significant. Once I graduated high school, I went off to college in Vancouver. I qualified as a teacher, moved in with my long-term girlfriend, and did all the regular things that regular people do. But, deep down, it all bored me. Yeah, I still hunted, but the urge was still rooted in me to move out into the woods, to live right there in the wilderness. As time passed, my girlfriend and I drifted apart. Eventually, we split up, and I guess I had a kind of epiphany. I decided, much to the horror of my family and friends, to sell my apartment and move up north to the wilderness area close to the Rockies. I had seen a cabin for rent online, made some inquiries, drove up to see it and paid the deposit there and then. The realtor didn't say much at the time, although I do remember he seemed surprised at my enthusiasm for moving to a 2-room log cabin off-grid, a mile from the nearest settlement. Nevertheless, it was exactly what I wanted, so I took it. I'd also seen a bar job advertised in the town nearby, and having plenty of experience as a part-time bartender when I was in college, I applied and got the job. The bar was, like almost all the local buildings, a single-storey log house located on the outskirts of the town. You'll see later why I won't refer to that town by name. Suffice to say, it was a sleepy fishing village between the woods and the river. From the front of the bar, you could see the Rockies in the distance beyond the river. I reckon there can have been more than a few hundred people in the town, but it was the centre for folks from out of the rural areas, and so it was busy enough to keep open a bar, a store, and a barber shop. My first day at the cabin, I spent unloading my stuff, and it didn't take long, as I deliberately got rid of as much as I could, bearing in mind it was a small cabin. Once I unpacked the car, I headed the 3 miles into town to the store to pick up some essentials. The lady behind the counter was highly friendly and welcoming. She would have been around 50 years of age, and she introduced herself as Sally. She explained that she was widowed and belonged to the local First Nation, whose location was about 10 miles upriver. She enthused about how beautiful the area was, and then she asked me where my cabin was. "Oh, it's just about 3 miles north, right by the river," I grinned. Sally's face fell. She looked away, then stared right at me and said, "Did the realtor explain about the place?" I shook my head. No, he didn't say much at all, I replied. Seems ideal for me, so what should I know? Sally shook her head. I guess somebody should tell you, so maybe it has to be me. That place has had some bad vibes as long as, well, anyone could remember, she sighed. When my husband was alive, when he was a boy, a group of hunters came and built that place. They came from the city. The second week they were there, they just disappeared. No trace. Nothing. The feds came and searched for them, everything, but nothing was ever found. She took a deep breath, then went on. After that, it was sold to a couple from the States. They wanted to use it for vacations. I wasn't long married at the time, and I remember they were nice people, good people. Then one day, they drove up to the store. My husband was working here at the time. The man came in like he had seen something really weird, like in a cold sweat. He just threw the cabin keys down right here on the counter and ran out. They drove off like the devil was after them and never came back. My husband went up to the cabin that afternoon to see what was what. He said the place wasn't even locked. They had left everything they couldn't carry. Food, clothes, furniture. They just fled. Something freaked them out real bad. I shrugged and smiled as reassuringly as I could. Maybe they saw a bear or a moose, or they just got scared, I suggested. Sally froze. A strange, misty look came across her face, as if she had been out to say more, but thought better of it. Yeah, I'm sure it was something like that. She smiled unconvincingly. Listen, she went on. Don't let me put you off. You seem like a nice guy, and I'm sure the place will feel like a home in no time. People round here are good people, good neighbours. You'll see. Sally smiled sweetly, and I paid for my groceries and headed back to the car. Once I got back to the cabin, that strange conversation with Sally seemed as if it had just been a dream. I packed away the groceries and other supplies, pulled a chair out onto the porch, cracked open a beer, and sat down to relax and enjoy the view. I lit a cigarette and watched the sun set over the horizon beyond the river. Reflecting on the water, I felt content. I'd come home. Once it got dark and it started to feel chilly, it was spring, I headed inside for the night. I enjoyed the feeling of a double bed to myself, and in the solitude and quiet, I soon drifted off into a deep sleep. About 2 a.m, I was awakened with a jolt from somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. There was this strange, unnerving noise. At first, I took it to be a human voice, but I quickly realised no human could produce such a sound. The initial impression was of someone trying to start a very old, very unreliable motorbike, like a spluttering, shuddering growl. This went on in several short bursts for around a minute. Then it changed to a more prolonged growl. And yet, knowing the sounds made by bears, mountain lions, and pretty much any other large mammal, nothing about it seemed familiar. There was something just wrong about that sound, something unnatural. I lay and listened for a while, but nothing more could be heard. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. Next morning, I headed back into the town to visit the barber shop and to check in with the bar manager ahead of my first shift. That afternoon, I went to the bar first to make myself known. The bar manager, Matt, was a big, fair-headed guy, like me in his early 30s, bearded and good-humoured. He showed me around the place and then grinned and said, "So Nate, I hear you're up in the old Robson place, eh?" "Robson place?" I echoed. "Yup," Matt chuckled. "It's named after the guy who built it back in the 50s. He built it as a love nest for himself and his blushing bride. But he came to a bad end, and ever since then, the locals have said the house has a bad vibe. Bullshit, if you ask me. He grinned broadly. So what happened to Robson? I asked, following Matt through the back door to the beer garden. Matt chuckled and replied, "My personal opinion is that he caught his old lady carrying on with another guy. Whatever the reason, he was found in the woods with his head missing. I reckon he blew himself away with a shotgun. Either that, or she or her lover did it. But she disappeared around then. They had a little girl. She must have made off into the woods. The cops found her wandering a couple of days later." Shit. That's the third bad story I've heard about this place, I chuckled uneasily. "Ah, relax," Matt laughed, pat on my shoulder. "It's just a house, and the little girl still lives up here. She's unique." He smirks knowingly. "Unique?" Yeah, she was raised by her dad's cousin in town, but she used to come back up and sleep outside the empty cabin before it was sold as a hunting cabin. She went missing when she was a teen, then reappeared with the baby. Wouldn't say whose it was nor where she'd been, but that kid is the strangest kid I ever saw." "Is? You mean they're still around?" I asked. "Sure," Matt went on. "They keep themselves to themselves. She's one of these new age type chicks, likes to live off grid. He's a big guy. He's a natural born footballer or wrestler. But she's homeschooled him, so he never got the chance to play sports. Weird. Anyway, you might see them out on the river if you're around." I parted company with Matt, as I wasn't due to start work until 4. I walked over to the barber shop, a small, traditional one-room place, manned by a single barber, who introduced himself as Kyle. He was a tall, lanky guy in his 20s with a shaved head, and he set about giving me a skin fade and beard trim while listening to my story of how I came to be in the area. It seemed Kyle was originally from Yukon, but had moved down in search of work a few years previously, so he wasn't up to speed with the local law about the Robson cabin. I felt sufficiently confident to ask him about the noise I'd heard during the night, as he'd also revealed he hunted and fished for salmon in the locality. "You heard it then?" He nodded. "The locals will tell you that that's the man of the woods, Sasquatch." He winked, and I chuckled, assuming he was joking with me. "So, what do you think it might be?" I asked. Kyle thought for a minute, then replied, "I don't know. I do know there are some pretty weird people around here, and I wouldn't be surprised if someone might make noises like that somehow to piss people off, but I can't be sure. Having said that, weird stuff has happened to me right out in the woods, not far from your place." "Really?" He nodded again. "The first time I was out in deer season, a few years back. I was on a game trail right up past your cabin, heading towards the edge of the First Nation Reserve. I saw a small tree, turned upside down, right in the middle of the trail. When I say small, I mean like 8 feet tall and thick. It was pulled up by the roots. I don't know who or what could do that." I felt a small chill. I asked, "What do you think it was?" "The tree," Kyle said. "A warning from who or what, I really don't know." I nodded. "So what else has happened?" Kyle went on. "I heard noises once when I was out fishing. That noise you heard last night was how it started. Then it went on, getting louder and higher, and at the end, it sounded like a woman screaming, only it wasn't a woman." "What do you think it was?" Kyle shook his head, sighing. "Wish I knew. Part of me doesn't want to know." The Deep Woods, Part 2. I processed this silently as Carl razor finished my neck and the edges of my beard. He changed the subject. Being a keen hunter, he was wanting to talk about my hunting experiences down near the coast. As I got up to pay the bill, I asked him where he'd recommend as the best hunting grounds. "Upriver, by the native reserve," he replied. "If you sweet-talk Sally in the store, she might be able to put in a word or two in the right ears to get you hunting access to the reserve. Her dad is a Nakota elder, so was her husband, who passed. They're good folks." I nodded. "Hey, thanks, man, and thanks for the trim. Maybe see you in the bar later on?" I grinned. "Sure," Carl smiled. "I'll test your ability to pour a proper pint of Guinness." I clocked in to work at 4. And sure enough, Carl showed up for the drink later. And I was constantly introduced by Matt and Carl to some of the regulars. Towards the end of the shift, Matt grinned over at me and asked, "So Nate, have you seen any of our friendly neighbours yet?" Carl and a few of the other guys at the billiard table heard this and snickered. I shook my head. "Nope. I thought the First Nations were my nearest neighbours." I smiled. Matt chuckled and replied, "Well, keep your eyes peeled for the lovely Miss Robson. She often wanders along the riverbank right by your place, at all times of the day and night." More chuckles ensued from the billiard players, and I glanced at Matt quizzically. He dug my ribs playful and said, "Just be careful if she starts flirting with you. Her big son is a jealous boy. Reckon there might be a Bates Motel thing going on there, hey?" Matt and the guys at the table laughed uproariously at this, but Carl was looking uneasy. I didn't get a chance to ask him what the deal was, and as the night wore on, my shift ended, and I left Matt to lock the place up. I headed back to the cabin, tired, but content that my first night at work had been a pretty easy going, and all the regulars, they seemed okay. I went straight to bed and slept right through until daylight, when the birdsong woke me up. I got up to fix coffee and glanced out towards the river. It was a beautiful spring day. After coffee, I got dressed and pulled out my pipe and tobacco pouch. I had filled my pipe, lit up, and was just combing my hair in the wall mirror when I noticed a reflection in the mirror. I stopped as I was just applying product to my hair and swung around to get a proper view of the figure through the front window. I saw a small, frail-looking woman, I guess between 60 and 70 years old, in what I would judge to be a nightdress, walking along the bank opposite my front of my cabin. She appeared to be looking for something. Her hair was grey, almost white, and fell down her back, almost to the waist. I decided to step out and greet her, partly from curiosity and partly from concern. It wasn't that warm and she was lightly clad. As I exited the front door, she startled and stopped walking, looking right at me. I smiled and waved as I approached. "Hey, my name's Nate. I just moved in here," I began, sounding as friendly as I could. The woman nodded uneasily. "I know," she said. Her voice sounded oddly shaky and husky, like she didn't talk much. "I saw you move in." That was creepy, I thought, but I kept grinning like an idiot. "So you live nearby?" I ventured. She nodded. Suddenly, to my surprise, she stuck out her hand, rapidly, as if to shake mine. "Jane Robson," she said, trying to smile but still looking so nervous. As I reached out to shake hands, she pulled her hand back suddenly. At that very instant, a battered pickup rolled up beside the cabin and parked up next to mine. I watched the truck, but I was aware that the woman was breathing heavily all of a sudden, almost like a panic attack. The driver's door of the pickup swung open and the driver got out. As soon as I saw him, I felt somehow like I couldn't breathe either, as what I saw so unnerved me. This guy was big. I'm 6'1", and used to play hockey for my school, but this fella was a head taller than me and bulky, just as Carl had described him the day before. He was clearly the son of this woman beside me. His build was unusual, but I'd played hockey with guys not much smaller, so it didn't strike me as abnormal. He was just built. It was his head that freaked me out. There are times when you see something that you know isn't right, and at the time, You can't focus on what it is, but eventually it comes to you, much later. This was one of those times. The guy had virtually no neck. His head sat on his wide, muscled shoulders like there was nothing between. His hair was thick, black and curly, not long, but the way it sat on him looked inhuman. His beard looked more normal, pretty much the same length as mine, hanging down to his chest. But between his hair and beard, his face was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. Well, at that time it was. It looked very much like pictures I'd seen in high school books of what they reckon Neanderthals would have looked like. His brows were heavy, thickly jutting and pronounced. His massive jaw protruded under the beard, and his mouth seemed somehow wider than it should be. I was suddenly aware that I was staring at this guy, and I quickly thought that wasn't good. He looked pissed off, and he was walking my way. Jane walked with me towards him, and stood facing him. Without a word, he gestured towards the pickup with his head. She went over and jumped into the passenger seat. I smiled as best I could at the big guy and tried to introduce myself. Nate Walker, I said cautiously. To my amazement, he responded. Good to meet you, Nate. Dan Robinson. Good to meet you, Nate. Dan Robson. Now, reading that, you're probably thinking it sounded like a regular guy introducing himself to a new neighbour. In truth, what I heard from his lips sounded unlike any human voice I'd ever heard. It was deep, hoarse, bass baritone, almost vibrating. It was so low-pitched. I have a pretty deep voice myself, but this was something else. Good to meet you and your mother. I smiled inanely, trying so hard to look as if I wasn't freaked. In response, Dan threw back his head. I'd probably have said he'd smiled if it were anyone else, but he bared his teeth in a way I'd never seen anyone do, and his teeth were big, square like human teeth, but just damn big. Without another word, he swung round to the truck, jumped in, and drove off. I spent a good while sitting on my porch right after that, smoking my pipe and trying to get my head around what had just happened. I analysed the whole event, even though it kind of lasted more than a few minutes, and thought over and over about Kyle and Matt and Sally's weird tales from the day before. I was still in disbelief at this stage. Looking back now, it was so obvious, but at the time, I just thought this woman was a recluse, socially awkward as a single mother in a country town, with a kid who clearly had some massive genetic defects, like giganticism or Herculism, or both. Damn, it just all felt so wrong. Anyway, I did my best to put the whole thing out of my mind, at least until I finished my shift at the bar that night. As we cleared up after closing time, I mentioned to Matt about my unusual visitors. He looked at me, no sign of humour this time. What did you make of the sun? He asked. His words dropped like stones. I don't know what to make of the whole thing, I replied truthfully. Truthfully, I have met and played with guys built like that, but that guy, there's something just strange. Matt nodded. One thing's for sure, whoever got Miss Jane pregnant wasn't from these parts, he said, lowering his voice. There's nobody around here, and nobody upriver in the tribal lands with genes like that. She's just plain crazy, but he's smart, you know? He doesn't talk, but he's strong and fast and smarter than he looks. I was about to explore this further when there was a knock at the back door. I opened it to find Sally, who was obviously just en route from the store after closing up. Hey Nate, Sally smiled warmly. My dad is coming over for dinner tomorrow. Why don't you come over for dinner too and meet him? He's a hunting nut, so you'll like him. I laughed at that and accepted the invitation gladly. That night was quiet again. I slept soundly and got up early, spent the morning cleaning my guns, and then went over to the store. Sally lived in a small trailer behind the store, and as soon as I arrived, I smelt the aroma of roasted chicken. My mouth watered. "Hey Nate, good to see you," Sally beamed as she opened the door. She ushered me inside and introduced me to her father, Tom, a native man in his 80s with weather-beaten features that evidenced his lifelong hunting passion. He and I soon got down to chatting about hunting over a cold beer. Dinner was delicious, and after we ate, I plucked up the courage to ask them about the noise I'd heard on my first night. A deathly silence filled the trailer as soon as I had spoken. Tom at length cleared his throat and replied, "Son, when I was a young boy, about 13, I went out into the deep woods alone one day to set some traps," he began. "That was the first time I was out alone, but I wasn't fearful. I knew the woods since I was little and I had my rifle. So I went up past the bend in the river, not far from the Robson place, although it wasn't built back then, and out into the woods. There was a good game trail out there, and I hiked the best part of 10 miles into the bush. I started having this eerie feeling of being watched, even though I hadn't seen more than a few rabbits along the trail, when I noticed how silent it had become. I stopped in the clearing, just by a big rock, to rest a while and think. I had no sooner stopped than a rock came flying at me, right out of the trees, and hit the big rock behind me. I reached for my gun, but something made me freeze, like I was unable to move. I saw the bushes move right across from me, and then it appeared. "Dad," Sally began, then faltered. Tom went on. "At first, I thought it must be a bear. It was big. What kind of bear throws rocks like that?" The bushes parted then, and I saw it. It must have been 7 feet tall. Its hair was black, just like a bear's, but it had hands just like a man, and stood up straight just like a man. I had never seen anything like it. When I was a kid, my mother used to warn us to stay out of the woods after dark in case the mountain devil got us. But I never believed it, until that day. He stared at me for what must have been over a minute, and I got up as slow as I could and backed away. It never took its eyes off of me the whole time. As I got back out of there, I heard the scream. That was the most likely of what you heard, son. It was another dreadful silence. Sally eventually said, "Nate, I know you think we're crazy and that this is just Indian tales, but there are dangers in the woods up here. We wouldn't want you to come to any harm." I nodded slowly. My heart was racing now, and now I was starting to make sense of what was going on around there. Tom sighed and went on. "Robson came here when I was a young man. He built that cabin with some of his buddies from down south. They used it for hunting trips. But then a group of them went missing. After that, Robson used it as a love nest for his married lover, and that was how he ended up dead in the woods." The silence was almost palpable now. After that, Tom went on. "People figured the cabin was cursed, but I don't believe that. No, sir. I believe they built it too close to the deep woods. The same thing I saw when I was a boy. He lives out there. He and his people. They don't want strangers around." Tom sounded conclusive. Sally changed the subject as best she could, but the atmosphere had changed. I felt a sense of foreboding that almost overwhelmed me. As I got up to leave, Tom got up and followed me to the door. "Son, take my advice," he said softly. "Find a place nearer to town. It's not safe out there. Look what happened to the Robson's daughter." I stared at him. His last words rang like a siren in my mind. I had known there was something about the strange Robson woman and her daughter. Now, I knew what it was, and how I wished that I hadn't known. A drove back to the cabin, and I was nearly halfway up the path when I slammed on the brakes and stopped dead. Right in front of me, dead centre of the path, was a rock, a boulder. It was the size of a car engine, and it hadn't been anywhere near the place before I left for town. I opened the car door and stepped out. I took a good, long look at the boulder in the fading daylight. It must have weighed as much as 800 pounds, and there was no way it had been there before. So, how the hell did it get there? The more I looked at it, the more it seemed like a message. I couldn't help thinking of the big Dan Robson. That wrestler physique, that strange, inexplicable encounter we'd had so recently. I got back into the car and swung around to the right, off the gravel path, and up the grassy area above the riverbank. I managed to get the car around it, but the thoughts of what Tom had told me wouldn't leave me. I walked into the house and poured myself a large whiskey. I sat down and looked out at the sunset over the river and thought long and hard about the events and conversation of the last few days. My rational, urbanised mind was telling me to stop thinking about the synergy between those Robsons and the thing, or things, in the woods. I spent a long time that evening cleaning my guns, and I was obviously more absorbed than I realised, because I noticed after 11 that I'd smoked more than half a pack of cigarettes. Eventually, I grew tired and headed off to bed. The night was peaceful, up until around 4 a.m. This time, it wasn't a growl or a scream that woke me. It was what I initially thought was birdsong. I could hear this strange chirping, whirring noise, almost mechanical, from some place near the cabin. I got up and dully realised it was still dark. What kind of bird sings in a pitch blackness in northern Canada? Without switching on a light, I lifted my gun from the shelf above my head. Still naked, I crept as silently as I could through the bedroom door and out into the main living room area. I thought the noise was coming from under the front window, and I managed to creep across the room below window height to avoid detection. Or so I thought. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then continued. As I got closer, I realised it wasn't bird-like at all. It sounded, for want of any other comparison, like a human mimicking a bird or small animal. So, the question arose in my mind. Who the hell does this kind of thing outside someone's house at 4 in the morning? I reached over to the light switch beside the door, keeping my trigger finger firmly poised on the rifle. I raised my head just enough to peer over the window ledge and then flicked the switch. The front porch light came on, illuminating Jane Robson. She stood there, shivering in another thin cotton dress. Her face was a mask of terror, glazed, her eyes expressing a fear that seemed, somehow, primeval. The curious thing is, looking back, she kept on making those noises after I switched the light on. I involuntarily stood bolt upright, immediately conscious of my nakedness. My gun hung limply by my side, as I felt sickening realisation that I'd been poised to shoot a defenceless old crazy woman. At that very moment, she uttered a screech. I can't convey how it sounded. It certainly wasn't a noise I'd ever heard from human lips before, and I pray I never will again. That screech, that sound which evoked thoughts of hyenas or similar wild beasts, was clearly a signal, for at that same moment a thunderous crash came from around the back of the cabin. I need to record all of this so carefully now. I know that whoever finds this, if anyone finds it, may never believe all that I saw. But I want this to be recorded so someone, at least, has the chance to know the truth. Instinctively raising my rifle, I sped to the back of the cabin, leaving the front door swinging widely behind me. A rush of chill air hit me as I threw the switch at the back door, and the floodlight flashed on to reveal the figure of Dan Robson, running for the woods at breakneck speed. The thing is, Dan was stark naked and running on all fours. There are things in this world I've always thought that no one else should ever see. One of those things is when a human being, or what you think is a human being, behaves in such a way that no human is capable of doing. I watched, transfixed, as Dan sped across that clearing and bounded uphill into the tree line. I saw enough detail in those few seconds to resolve my doubts and confirm that these creatures, people, whatever, were after me. It wasn't just the fact that this being who had driven to my cabin on the day or two previously had carried on a conversation with me, or who had driven his mother home afterwards, was now bounding exactly like a gorilla behind my house. It wasn't just the fact that his superbly muscled body was covered in thick black hair, thicker and coarser than any man's body hair that I'd ever seen, and I'm a hairy enough. Or that his penis was visibly erect, just like that of an ape displaying aggression. No, it was the fact that the crash I heard when Jane screamed was caused by her son jumping off my cabin roof onto the pile of logs I'd kept out back. That creature had been on my roof, waiting to jump me. I was sure of it. My mind began to focus again, and after I'd been exposed to that initial shock, I wheeled round and saw the trembling figure of Jane Robson, tearful now, and hugging herself a few feet from the cabin. "Please, please," she sobbed. "It's his way. He hunts like that. It's his way of his people." I felt every hair on my body stand on end. "His people?" I croaked, my bile rising in my throat. She nodded. "Please. They have been here for so long. Before my father came here. Before the Nakoda, even. Please. It's not safe for you." At that, she turned on her heel, and to my utter horror, dropped on all fours, exactly as her son had done. She bounded off into the trees at shocking speed. I staggered back into the cabin as dawn began breaking over the woods. It took me a full hour before I stopped shaking, and I vomited twice. Once I washed, dressed and had coffee, I began to think rationally about all that I'd seen. Clearly, these people, or whatever they were a danger to me. I knew if I left, not only would I lose my deposit on the cabin, and probably more once the landlord found out, but I'd also be admitting defeat. Why should I leave? The sensible side of my brain tried to reason with me for a long time. The stubborn side of that same brain said, "Stay. You're armed. You're a grown man." Daylight can make us feel so differently. After an experience in the darkness, my mind began rationalising, arguing with myself that this was just a crazy woman, probably traumatised by her father's suicide, who had a child with some genetic deformity, who hasn't seen those wrestlers and actors who are true giants. All these Indian folktales are probably based on fact, but there's nothing concrete to suggest Tom had seen anything other than a large black bear when he was a kid. I decided to go fishing that day to settle my nerves. I walked downriver to the area Carl had recommended and spent several tranquil hours on the banks, just fishing and trying to get my head together. Towards mid-afternoon, I decided to head back and get changed for my shift at the bar. So I packed up, lit my pipe and walked at a leisurely pace back towards the cabin. It was a beautiful day, and the truly idyllic surrounding made me feel that all was well, that I could stay and somehow work through this. I was wrong. When I reached the cabin, I stopped dead in my tracks. Right there, maybe 10 yards out in front of the porch, was my car, on its roof. I staggered to the cabin and leaned against the wall to steady myself. That was when I saw the footprints. My feet are big. I'm size 11, but these were at least 13. but there were so many in the mud, and they were at least 3 different sizes, so that makes me think Dan had company, and they were all bear footprints. I know bear tracks, moose, and all the rest. These were human-shaped, but all bigger than mine. I snapped, then I threw my fishing gear into the cabin, loaded my rifle, and stalked right into the woods. Thinking back now, I was stupid. I should have headed to town with as much of my stuff as I could carry and sought help. But no, I'd had enough. I was mad. I wanted to confront these things. Most times, I've been deep in the woods in the daylight. I've never been afraid, even when I was alone. Now was different. There wasn't a sound, no birds, insects, not even the breath of wind. My skin crawled, and I could feel the hairs on my body standing on end. I was amazed at how many tracks these creatures had left. It seemed they either didn't care if I followed them, or else they wanted me to follow them. I was on their trail for maybe 3 or 4 miles. Then I suddenly had this creeping sensation of being watched. It's a strange feeling. It starts in the very pit of the stomach, then rises up to fill you with that awful, slow sense of dread. It was starting to get dark, and I only had a small flashlight and my lighter. I decided to rest a while and decide whether to start retracing my steps. So when I found a small clearing with a large rock I could lean my back against, I sat down, rifle across my knees. The darkness had just fallen when the howling started. I could sense that it was more than one, and this was confirmed when I realised they were 3 different directions surrounding me. This howling, inhuman, intense howling went on for more than an hour. Then the same strange bird-like sounds that I'd heard the previous night outside the cabin. My flashlight battery had just died, so I'm using my lighter to write by. I can see the red glow of eyes. Those eyes are just beyond the bushes inside the tree line, and the height of the ground tells me they're bigger than me. My rifle is my only hope of seeing morning. If anyone finds this, I want to apologise to my folks for not saying goodbye. I want them to know. Postscript. Ghost River Herald article, 23rd of May 2017. Police have issued an appeal regarding the last known whereabouts of Mr. Nathaniel Walker, a bartender from Ghost River area, who has been missing since May 20th. Mr. Walker was last seen at a local general store last Sunday. He's described as 6'1", dark hair and a beard, athletic build, sleeve tattoo on the right arm. When last seen, he was wearing a pale blue shirt, dark blue jeans and tan rigger boots. Police are concerned after Mr. Walker's SUV was found overturned outside a property he had recently begun leasing, just outside the town boundary. It is believed that the interior of the same cabin had been emptied hurriedly and completely, as none of the Mr. Walker's personal effects were found inside the property. Fingerprints and footprints found at the ransacked property were described as inconclusive. Any members of the public with any information regarding Mr. Walker's movements can contact Ghost River County Police Department at the contact details below. Postscript. Grand Prairie Advertiser, article, 30th of June 2017. Remains found believed to be missing man. Human remains found in a forest area adjacent to local First Nation lands are believed by police to be those of Mr. Nate Walker, who went missing over a month ago from rented accommodation in Ghost River County. It is believed that the remains, consisting of a human skeleton minus the head, were found atop a large rock in a wooded area close to the nearby Stony Reserve. Ghost River Herald, 2nd of July 2017. Mystery surrounds remains in forest. Reports from the scene of the recent discovery of skeletal remains, believed to be those of Nate Walker, missing since the 20th of May, suggest a possible homicide. Amidst local fears of a supernatural or ritual element to the former schoolteacher's untimely death, sources close to Ghost River Police said, "The thing is, the skeleton is definitely Nate Walker, but the head is missing. It's also very strange that the bones were completely devoid of flesh or skin. Even with prey animals in the vicinity, it's strange how clean they were, considering he died a matter of weeks ago." Another source said, "The guy's rifle was found below the rock where he was found. It hadn't been fired. It was still loaded. And it had no prints on it, other than Walker's. His clothes were also found beside the rifle, neatly folded up and placed in a neat pile, and showed no sign of any bloodstains or prints. Whatever happened, he must have undressed and laid down his gun before being decapitated, and the remaining body placed at the top of the 9-foot tall rock." A local storekeeper who declined to give her name told reporters that hundreds of large human-like footprints had been found in the wilderness area where the remains were found by a hunter from the adjacent reserve. A Ghost River Police spokesperson declined to comment on the report. Police investigations are ongoing. Wow, hope you guys enjoyed that short series there, 3-part series in one. Humongous shout out to the author there, NorthernMountains76. Thank you ever so much for penning that fantastic story. I'm sure the listeners really did enjoy it. Guys, please do let us know down below what you thought in the comments. Of course, please do share and like. Your support really does help. And as ever, guys, remember, if you're thinking of purchasing a brand new cabin out in the deep woods, do a check on the history of the land and maybe even the history of the property. But above all, remember, be safe.
Not sorry.